So imagine you are standing in the center of this, like, grand, pristine art gallery,
Okay, I'm picturing it.
and the room is completely empty except for these two massive floor-to-ceiling mirrors, and they're facing each other. Both of them are reflecting the exact same country.
Right.
You step up to the first mirror, and the reflection is just breathtaking. You are looking at this shining, futuristic beacon of human achievement. I mean, the nation in the glass is just glowing with immense wealth, world-class healthcare, and highly educated citizens.
It's basically the gold standard.
Exactly. It proudly wears this badge, placing it at number 13 in the entire world for human development. It looks like the absolute finish line of human progress.
Yeah, the ultimate success story of the 20th and 21st centuries.
But then you turn around, you face the second mirror, and the reflection of that exact same country is just fractured. The glass is stained with this massive looming shadow of ecological debt.
A completely different picture.
Completely. And in the second mirror, that wealthy, healthy nation plummets from number 13 straight down the global rankings and crashes at number 110.
Wow.
Right. It's a 90-place free fall.
Which honestly forces anyone looking at those two mirrors to completely reevaluate the reflection in the first one.
Exactly. And this isn't like some hypothetical riddle. It is the documented statistical reality of Singapore as captured in the data we're unpacking today.
Yeah, the numbers don't lie.
They really don't. We are pulling directly from the United Nations 2023 and 2024 Human Development Report. It's this incredibly comprehensive data set that spans from 1990 all the way to 2023.
And we're pairing that with historical demographic data, plus some really eye-opening ecological footprint papers.
Right. So the mission for this deep dive is to understand the hidden mechanics of global prosperity. We're going to explore how the world actually measures human progress and how Singapore engineered itself into this textbook example of that progress.
And ultimately, we need to confront this sort of mathematical paradox of modern civilization.
Which is what, exactly?
Well, is our current blueprint for development simply a process of, overdrawing our planetary bank account?
Oh, that is such a good way to put it, overdrawing the bank account.
Yeah, because for you listening, whether you're analyzing global economics or mapping out corporate sustainability, or just looking at the growth of your own city, understanding the gap between those two mirrors is going to fundamentally change how you measure success.
I totally agree. But to grasp why Singapore falls 90 places, we first have to understand the architecture of the mirrors themselves, right? Like, how is this yardstick of progress actually built?
Exactly. We have to look at how that yardstick has evolved over time. Because for decades, the yardstick was painfully simple.
GDP, gross domestic product.
Right. A country wanted to prove it was thriving, so it
Uh-huh.
just pointed to this single massive number. It was the universal scoreboard.
But this UN data we're looking at today, it completely rejects that premise, doesn't it?
It does. Completely.
Yeah.
Because relying on GDP to measure human progress is basically equivalent to measuring the success of a hospital solely by calculating its gross billing revenue.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, while actively ignoring how many patients actually survive their surgeries.
That's a terrifying analogy, actually.
But it's accurate. GDP measures economic volume. It tells you money is moving around, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the lived reality or the physical health or the intellectual growth of the actual human beings operating inside that economy.
So that blind spot is what prompted the United Nations to shift the global paradigm.
Exactly. That's why they created the Human Development Index, or the HDI.
And that's the classic trio, right? Health, wealth, and education.
You got it. The UN established that true development requires all three of those dimensions functioning simultaneously. You can't just have one.
Okay, so let's break those down. First one is health.
Right, a long and healthy life, which is mathematically anchored by life expectancy at birth.
Makes sense. And the second is education.
Yes, access to knowledge. They calculate that by combining the expected years of schooling for a kid just entering the system with the mean years of schooling for the adult population.
Okay, and the third pillar.
A decent standard of living, which is measured by gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
I mean, the logic there is pretty airtight. You can have all the money in the world, but if your citizens are dying at 40 from preventable diseases, you are not a developed nation.
Exactly.
And on the flip side, if your people live to be 90, but they can't read and they live in abject poverty, you aren't developed either.
Right. But the UN didn't just stop at that baseline HDI. This data set introduces these other layers, adjusting the scores for what we might call different justices.
Justices, like social justice metrics.
Basically, yeah. because the evolution of these metrics reveals this growing awareness of our statistical blind spots. Researchers quickly realized that an impressive national average can be a brilliant disguise for systemic suffering.
Oh, because a high average income doesn't mean everyone is doing well.
Precisely. It might just mean you have 3 trillionaires at the top and millions of people living in squalor at the bottom.
The average looks great, but the reality is a nightmare.
Right. So the UN introduced the Gender Development Index and the Gender Inequality Index, the GDI and the GII.
Okay, so what do those isolate?
They isolate the gap in achievements and opportunities between men and women. The philosophical stance here is that a society fundamentally fails the definition of developed if half of its demographic is structurally left behind.
That makes total sense. And then they applied that same logic to class and geography, right? With the IHDI.
Yes, the inequality-adjusted HDI. This metric calculates the gap between the rich and the poor, or the healthy and the sick, within the borders of the exact same country.
So it takes that shiny baseline HDI score and penalizes it based on how unevenly the health, wealth, and education are actually distributed.
The mechanism of the IHDI is super crucial to understand. It uses a mathematical formula to discount the national average according to the level of inequality.
So if everyone in the country has the exact same life expectancy, same education, same income,
Then the IHDI perfectly equals the HDI. There's no penalty. But the wider the internal gaps, the heavier the mathematical penalty becomes, and the further the IHDI falls below that baseline score.
it functions exactly like a corporate income statement.
How do you mean?
Well, if the traditional HDI is a company's gross revenue, the flashy top-line number, then the IHDI is your net profit. It is what you actually get to take home after you deduct all the internal waste, the friction, and the inefficiencies of inequality.
That is a perfect way to look at it. And applying that corporate analogy forward brings us to the fourth, and honestly easily the most controversial metric in the entire data set.
The PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI.
Yes. So if the IHDI is your net profit, the PHDI is the sudden, horrifying audit revealing that the company only generated those profits by illegally pumping toxic sludge into the municipal water supply.
Man, and this is the metric that creates that second mirror we talked about at the beginning.
Yes, exactly. The PHDI takes a country's baseline development score and actively penalizes it based on 2 very specific environmental factors:
Which are?
carbon emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
So it calculates the physical, ecological cost of maintaining a country's lifestyle.
Yeah. It is the most disruptive metric introduced in the history of human development tracking because it explicitly forces economic progress to internalize its collateral damage.
Okay, before we zoom in on how that collateral damage completely upends Singapore's ranking, I feel like we need to establish the baseline.
Good idea.
We need to look at the global picture over the last 30 years. If we take the traditional unadjusted HDI for the entire planet, like the gross revenue of humanity from 1990 to 2023, what does that trajectory look like?
The macroscopic view is, honestly, undeniably a story of relentless historical triumph.
Really? Even with everything going on?
Yeah. In 1990, the global HDI sat at roughly 0.60, but fast forward to 2023, and it has climbed steadily to 0.756.
Okay, let's ground those decimals in human reality for anyone listening. A jump from 0.60 to 0.756 on a scale that only goes to 1.0. I mean, that might sound like a minor statistical shift.
It sounds tiny.
But translated into physical lives, that 0.15 increase is the sound of thousands of new schools opening in rural communities.
Absolutely.
It's the deployment of basic sanitation or cold chain vaccine networks across entire continents. It represents hundreds of millions of human beings crossing the threshold out of extreme subsistence level poverty.
It is arguably the most successful 30-year run in the history of our species. The sheer scale of the logistical and economic coordination required to move a global average by 150 points in 3 decades is just staggering.
But there's always a but, right?
There is. When we scrutinize the timeline of that climb, the data exposes a deeply concerning structural fragility.
What happens?
Well, if you trace the global HDI line graph from 1990, it plots this smooth, predictable upward slope for nearly 30 consecutive years. But when the timeline hits 2020 and 2021, the line violently snaps.
It drops.
Yes. The global average drops down to 0.742.
The shockwave of the pandemic.
The pandemic was the catalyst, yes. But looking at the mechanics of the drop, researchers don't just categorize it as a temporary epidemiological blip.
What is it then?
We view it as a glaring diagnostic warning about how easily our developmental architecture can unravel. The drop wasn't solely because of virus-caused mass casualties, dragging down the life expectancy metric.
It was everything else falling apart, too.
Right. It was the cascading failure of the other pillars.
Like global supply chains seizing up, destroying livelihoods, and tanking the GNI metric.
Exactly. And the education pillar suffered massive, invisible damage.
Oh, because the schools closed.
Yeah, when schools closed globally, millions of girls in developing nations were pulled out of the classroom to assist with household labor, or they were married off early. And a significant percentage of them never returned to the education system.
That is heartbreaking.
It really is.
Yeah.
The 2020 plunge demonstrated that our baseline development isn't this indestructible concrete fortress. It's more like a highly complex, precarious suspension bridge that can be compromised by a single systemic gust of wind.
Wow. Okay, so we have a global average that rose valiantly for 30 years, proved its vulnerability, and is now attempting to recover. But earlier you said the concept of a global average is inherently misleading.
It is, because an average mass distribution.
Right. If the global HDI is 0.756, who is actually holding that wealth and health? When you filter the world through the inequality-adjusted HDI, the IHDI, what actually happens to that progress?
The bottom basically falls out. When we apply the IHDI to the global data in 2023, the world lost 21.95% of its total human development potential simply because of the friction of inequality.
Wait, nearly 22%. Just let that sink in for a second. We spent 3 decades building up our global infrastructure, innovating medical breakthroughs, expanding educational access, and over a fifth of all that accumulated progress just vanishes into the void between the upper crust and the working class.
Vanishes completely.
I mean, that makes the traditional HDI look like a PR campaign rather than a reflection of reality.
It really highlights the flaws in just looking at the top line number. And the mechanics of that 22% loss are fascinating when you break them apart.
Okay, let's break it down.
Visualize the loss as a waterfall chart. You start at the top edge with your raw maximum potential HDI score of 0.756. As the water cascades down, it hits different ledges of inequality and volume just splashes away.
Okay, so what's the first ledge?
The first ledge it hits is the inequality in life expectancy. This chips away about 12.9% of the total score.
I find that specific number 12.9% incredibly revealing because it tells us that longevity and basic physical survival are still tightly tethered to the zip code you were born in.
Without a doubt.
But honestly, given the massive wealth gaps in the world, I would have expected the health inequality penalty to be way higher than 13%. Why is biology somehow more egalitarian than economics?
That's a great question. It really comes down to the mechanics of modern medicine and the principle of diminishing returns.
Diminishing returns, how?
Well, basic health interventions like childhood immunizations, iodine and salt, clean drinking water, basic antibiotics, they are incredibly cheap to manufacture. And they can be scaled by governments and NGOs across impoverished populations with relative ease.
Right. A $2 measles vaccine fundamentally alters the life expectancy of a child in a low-income nation.
Exactly. You get massive gains at the bottom for very little cost. Meanwhile, at the top end of the wealth spectrum, a billionaire can spend $50 million on concierge medicine and experimental stem cell therapies, but it won't buy them an extra 50 years of life.
Oh, I see. There is a biological ceiling.
Yes. Because it's cheap to raise the bottom and impossible to infinitely raise the top, health outcomes tend to cluster more tightly together compared to wealth.
Okay, so the water hits the first ledge. We lose about 13% to health gaps. Where does the real devastation happen?
The next ledge down. Income inequality. When the formula adjusts for the distribution of wealth, it carves out a massive 30.35% loss to our global development score.
30%. So the bottleneck isn't a lack of capital on the planet. The bottleneck is a structural failure to let that capital flow downward.
Precisely. The mechanisms of wealth accumulation are fundamentally different from the distribution of a vaccine. Wealth is sticky.
Sticky.
It consolidates. Financial systems, tax codes that favor capital gains over labor, inherited assets, compounding interest, they all act as a gravitational pull, dragging capital to the absolute top of the pyramid.
So it's designed to funnel upward.
Yeah. Distributing wealth equitably requires complex, often politically impossible, structural taxation and labor reforms. So when you combine the modest losses from health and education gaps with the catastrophic losses from wealth hoarding, that shiny global HDI of 0.756 is violently downgraded.
Down to what?
To a global IHDI of just 0.59.
Oh, man. It's the ultimate bait and switch. It's like we're looking at a beautifully baked pie in the bakery window, only to realize The baker has structurally designed the economy so that one person gets three-quarters of the pie and 8 billion people are fighting over the crust.
That is exactly the reality of the global distribution metric. However, the data isn't uniformly bleak on the equity front.
There's some good news.
Yes. If we isolate the gender metrics in this dataset, we find one of the most consistent, hard-fought victories of the modern era.
Okay, the GII, the Gender Inequality Index.
Right, so the GII measures the loss of achievement due to structural disadvantages faced by women, specifically in reproductive health, political and social empowerment, and labor market participation.
And what does the trend look like there?
In 1993, the global GII sat at a troubling 0.52, but by 2023, that number had dropped to 0.455.
Which is a victory because with inequality indexes, you want the number to shrink towards zero. The smaller the index, the smaller the gap.
Exactly.
So what were the specific levers that pulled that number down globally?
The most profound driver within the data was the dramatic plunge in maternal mortality rates.
Wow.
Yeah. The reduction of women dying from pregnancy-related causes over the last 30 years has been staggering. It went from about 387 deaths per 100,000 live births globally down to 216.
And that isn't just a health victory. The ripple effects of a mother surviving childbirth, I mean, they redefine the economic trajectory of her entire community.
It really does. Everything changes.
When a woman survives, she remains in the labor force. She ensures her children, particularly her daughters, stay in school rather than dropping out to take over domestic duties. She continues to contribute to the local GDP.
Exactly. Investing heavily in reproductive health isn't just a basic moral imperative. It acts as a massive economic multiplier.
Right.
And the data proves that unequivocally. But, even acknowledging the tremendous strides in gender equity, that overarching 22% global loss to inequality remains a heavy anchor.
It naturally raises a question regarding the limits of our economic systems, doesn't it?
It really does. If the entire world is structurally struggling to distribute its wealth and health, is it actually possible for a modern, highly capitalist nation to beat the game?
Can a society generate immense wealth without completely hollowing out its middle class?
Which brings us to the first mirror, the textbook example of human development done right.
Let's pull up the specific numbers for Singapore, because looking at their traditional HDI trajectory from 1990 to 2023 is like looking at a completely different species of data.
It really is an outlier.
In 1990, Singapore's HDI was 0.819, already a very strong, highly developed score. But by 2023, they didn't just inch upward, they skyrocketed to 0.946.
Securing their position at number 13 in the world out of nearly 200 countries and territories.
Okay, let's dissect the three pillars that built that 0.946 score, starting with health. In 2023, the life expectancy for a citizen in Singapore reached an astonishing 83.7 years.
That is an increase of over 9 years since 1990.
Wait, 9 extra years of life for an entire population?
Yes. And the mechanics of adding 9 years to a population's life expectancy change drastically depending on where you start.
What do you mean?
Well, if a country's life expectancy is 50, you can add 10 years simply by building sewer systems and handing out penicillin. It's an infrastructure problem.
Right, the cheap bottom-up interventions we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But Singapore was already at 74.6 years in 1990. Pushing an entire population from 74 to almost 84 years doesn't happen with basic sanitation.
So how does it happen?
It requires an obsessively optimized, hyper-efficient, state-of-the-art healthcare apparatus. It means your society has successfully managed complex, expensive, age-related chronic diseases.
Right, diabetes, heart disease, oncology.
Right, they've done it across a rapidly aging population.
Okay, then you look at the education pillar. The mean years of schooling. So the average time an adult has spent in formal education surged from about 7.5 years in 1990 to nearly 12 years today.
Almost a 5-year jump.
Think about the generational shift that represents. They took an entire population and fundamentally upgraded their baseline operating system, adding the equivalent of a full high school and partial college education to the national average.
And that highly educated, physically robust population feeds directly into the engine of the third pillar.
Wealth creation.
Yes.
And this wealth metric is where the data stops looking like a chart and starts looking like a typo.
It really is wild.
The UN tracks gross national income, or GNI, per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity so we can compare apples to apples globally. In 1990, Singapore's GNI per capita was roughly $45,000. Very respectable.
But by 2023,
By 2023, it exploded to an astounding $111,239.
And we established earlier that the global average GNI per capita sits at roughly $20,327.
So Singapore's income per capita is 5.47 times the global average.
Let's visualize that.
Yeah, picture a sprawling global neighborhood. Almost every house on the street is pulling in about $20,000 a year. The families are getting by, but budgets are tight.
Typical global average.
Right. Then you look down at the end of the cul-de-sac, and there's one pristine, high-tech, immaculately landscaped house generating over $111,000 a year. That single house is Singapore in the context of the global economy.
Looking at the mechanics of development theory, Singapore is the ultimate masterclass in the compounding loop of human capital.
The compounding loop.
Yeah, think about it. They are a tiny island without a drop of oil or vein of gold in their soil. They didn't extract their wealth, they synthesized it.
By doing what?
They positioned themselves as a vital node for global trade, shipping, and high-value financial services. But crucially, the state then aggressively captured that generated wealth and ruthlessly reinvested it back into the other two pillars.
Right, the cyclone effect.
Precisely. The state funds world-class schools and hospitals. That produces a smarter, healthier workforce. A smarter workforce attracts highly complex, lucrative foreign corporate investment,
Which then generates even larger tax revenues.
which the state then funnels back into building even better research universities and specialized medical centers. The loop feeds itself, spinning faster and faster, driving that HDI score up to 0.946.
The logic of the cyclone is beautiful, but logic also dictates a severe side effect.
Inequality.
Right. We just spent 20 minutes dissecting how the global economy systematically punishes the average worker, losing 22% of progress to inequality. And usually when you see a country generating hyper-capitalist wealth, when you see that $111,000 house at the end of the street, you assume the inside of the house is deeply dysfunctional.
You assume the parents are hoarding all the cash while the kids are sleeping on the floor eating scraps.
Exactly. If Singapore is operating as a fiercely competitive global financial hub, surely their inequality loss must be massive. I mean, a society doesn't average $111,000 a year without a class of multi-billionaires heavily skewing the math while the working class cleans the floors.
That is the assumption almost any economist would make. High capitalism inevitably breeds high inequality. But the UN dataset reveals a stunning anomaly.
What's the number?
When researchers apply the inequality-adjusted HDI to Singapore, calculating the internal gaps in health, education, and wealth, their development loss is only 13.002%.
Wait, let me make sure I have that right. The global average loss to inequality is nearly 22%. Singapore's loss is only 13%.
That's right.
They are a hyper-wealthy banking hub, and they are almost 10 percentage points more equitable than the rest of the planet.
Yes. Their resulting IHDI score stands strong at 0.823. And to be clear, a 13% loss means utopia doesn't exist. There is still a gap between the wealthy elite and the average worker.
Sure.
But compared to the baseline reality of modern civilization, that level of equity is remarkably contained.
How is that mechanically possible? How does a city known for luxury shopping, massive banking sectors, and extreme wealth concentration prevent the bottom from falling out of the working class?
It is possible because Singapore does not operate on a pure, unchecked, laissez-faire free market.
What do they operate on?
They operate on a highly specific, aggressively engineered model of state-led capitalism. It's not just about allowing corporations to generate wealth, it's about the state building a massive, inescapable funnel.
Funnel over what?
A funnel that captures a portion of that wealth and forcefully redistributes it as physical infrastructure and social equity. And the most potent mechanism of this is their public housing system.
The HDD flats. Let's dig into how those actually work, because calling it public housing gives a Western listener completely the wrong idea. We hear public housing and we picture neglected, underfunded, marginalized projects.
That couldn't be further from the truth in Singapore. The Housing and Development Board, or HDB, builds and manages the housing for over 80% of the entire citizen population.
80%.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is not housing for the poor. It is the default housing for the nation. Decades ago, the government aggressively acquired the land. They built the high-rises.
But how do people pay for it?
Through a mandatory savings scheme called the Central Provident Fund, or CPF. Both employees and employers are legally required to contribute a significant percentage of wages into a state-managed account.
So the state forces you to save your money and then allows you to use those forced savings to purchase a 99-year lease on an HDB flat built by the state.
Exactly. And this mechanism achieves something economically miraculous. By controlling the supply, the land, and the financing of housing, the state effectively neuters the kind of catastrophic, speculative housing inequality that is currently hollowing out the middle class in cities like London, New York, or San Francisco.
Because if you aren't drowning in exorbitant private rent, you have a secure foundation.
Exactly. That stability translates directly into better baseline health outcomes, and it allows families to invest their remaining income into their children's education, pulling up the bottom of the HDI pillars.
That makes so much sense. And that structural equity shows up in their gender metrics as well. Looking at the UN data, Singapore ranks 8th globally in the Gender Inequality Index.
8th in the world.
We talked about how the global maternal mortality rate dropped to 216 deaths per 100,000 live births. In Singapore, that number is 7.45.
It is practically a statistical zero.
Furthermore, their female labor force participation sits robustly at 62.6%.
Because the state infrastructure, the reliable housing, safe public transit, standardized schooling, it all acts as a support lattice. The society is structurally engineered to allow women to participate heavily in the economic engine without the friction found in less organized states.
If you are listening to this right now, I really want you to mentally compare this to your own country or your own city. Does the astronomical wealth generated by the top 1% of your economy actually translate into universally accessible, world-class public health and education for the working class?
Most people would probably say no.
Right. But in Singapore's traditional HDI model, the data undeniably proves that it does. They took the rules of 20th century development, grow your economy, educate your people, keep people alive, manage the inequality, and they absolutely beat the game.
They are the pristine, shining reflection in that first mirror.
They engineered a masterpiece of human capital, which brings us inevitably to the plot twist.
The second mirror.
We have celebrated the longevity, the wealth, and the state-engineered fairness. But what happens when the UN pulls back the curtain? What happens to Singapore's flawless 0.946 score when we introduce the fourth metric, the planetary pressures-adjusted HDI?
The floor completely collapses.
How bad is it?
When you factor in the ecological footprint required to maintain that pristine society, Singapore's score violently plummets to 0.618.
Mathematically, that is a 34.67% development discount. The UN looks at their progress and essentially slashes a third of it away as an ecological penalty.
And context is critical here. The average global penalty for planetary pressures is roughly 10%.
So Singapore's penalty is more than triple the global average.
Yes. And the resulting drop in their global ranking is devastating. Singapore falls from the elite vanguard at top 13, straight down a vertical cliff, landing at 110th place in the world.
Okay, wait, I have to challenge the logic of this metric.
Go for it.
Let's look at the physical reality of the island. Anyone who has ever traveled to Singapore, or even just watched a documentary about it, knows that it is aggressively, remarkably green.
It is very lush.
Their global tourism branding is literally a city in nature. You step off the plane at Changi Airport, and you are immediately standing inside an indoor jungle with a massive multi-story waterfall.
Sure.
You drive downtown to Gardens by the Bay, and you see these towering, futuristic super trees. They mandate that skyscrapers must incorporate vertical greenery. The streets are pristine. There is no smog choking the skyline. How does a city covered in meticulously curated gardens end up with an ecological grade so abysmal it drops 90 places on a UN index?
It's a vital question because it exposes a profound global delusion about what sustainability actually means in the 21st century.
What do you mean?
We have fundamentally confused urban landscaping with planetary equilibrium.
No.
Yeah. The PHDI metric does not care about your aesthetic. It doesn't give you points for planting ferns in a hotel lobby, or keeping litter off the sidewalks, or having clean air within your immediate borders.
What does it measure, then?
It measures two brutal, unyielding metrics: the carbon emissions you pump into the shared global atmosphere, and the raw physical materials you extract from the earth to sustain your economy.
So the UN isn't grading how pretty the city is. They are auditing the receipt. They are measuring exactly what Singapore is pulling out of the Earth's crust to survive.
Exactly. And when you audit the receipt, you realize that Singapore is the ultimate victim of its own high-consumption, high-import economic model.
Let's deconstruct that receipt, starting with the carbon footprint. According to the UN dataset, Singapore produces 8.19 tons of carbon dioxide per capita.
That is nearly double the global average of about 4.5 tons.
Producing double the global average of carbon is intense, especially for a tiny island that doesn't have hundreds of miles of sprawling suburbs where everyone is forced to commute in pickup trucks for 2 hours a day. But if we look at the data, the carbon isn't even the metric that breaks them. The true devastation is in the second metric, the material footprint.
The material footprint is the specific metric that drives them down to 110th place.
What exactly does that measure?
It measures the total amount of raw material, so biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals that are extracted anywhere in the world to meet the final consumption demands of a specific country.
And what's the number for Singapore?
For the average citizen in Singapore, their material footprint is an astronomical 53.04 tons per year.
Let's stop and make that number visceral, 53 tons.
It's hard to even picture.
Right. A standard mid-sized sedan weighs a little over 1.5 tons. Imagine taking 30 of those cars and stacking them on top of each other into a towering pillar of steel, glass, and plastic.
Okay, I see it.
That sheer mass represents the physical weight of the natural resources extracted, processed, shipped, and consumed to sustain one single person's lifestyle in Singapore for just 12 months.
And remember the global baseline. The average human being on Earth has a material footprint of 12.7 tons.
So Singapore is ripping through 4.17 times the global average in physical materials.
Yes.
How does the math on that even work? Obviously, an average guy living in an HDB flat isn't personally eating 53 tons of food a year or hoarding 50 tons of raw iron ore in his living room. Where is all of this physical mass actually going? What is driving this extreme consumption?
This is where we confront the inescapable vulnerability of the island city-state model. Singapore is an economic powerhouse built on a piece of land with virtually zero domestic natural resources.
Right. They have to import everything.
To build and maintain that $111,000 a year standard of living, they must import absolutely everything from beyond their borders. Consider their physical geography alone. To accommodate their growing population and massive industrial sectors, Singapore has actively expanded the physical size of its island by over 20% since independence.
Through land reclamation.
Yes. But you don't magically create land out of nothing. You build it by dumping millions upon millions of tons of imported sand and gravel into the sea.
Oh, so the sand itself counts toward the footprint.
Exactly. The sheer weight of the sand imported from neighboring countries to expand their coastlines, to build the Marina Bay Financial District, and construct their megaport facilities. It adds a massive invisible weight to their material footprint.
Then you factor in the concrete and steel required to constantly upgrade that infrastructure to build the new HDB towers, the underground transit systems, the shopping malls.
It adds up incredibly fast.
But it's not just the physical buildings, is it? It's the engine of the economy itself.
Precisely. Singapore's wealth is largely derived from being one of the busiest maritime logistics hubs and oil refining centers on the planet.
So massive cargo ships from all over the world dock there to refuel and exchange goods.
Right. Crude oil is shipped in, refined into aviation fuel and marine diesel, and shipped out. Even though a significant portion of those products are eventually exported, the heavy, resource-intensive industrial processes required to operate that global node occur within their borders.
And the ecological accounting mechanism of the PHDI attributes the material weight of sustaining that high-octane economic engine back to the end consumer, enjoying the wealth it generates.
You got it.
The irony is breathtaking. They have engineered a perfectly optimized, highly educated, fiercely equitable society inside their borders. But the only way they can mathematically sustain that utopia is by running a massive, unsustainable extraction deficit with the rest of the planet.
Which brings us to the profound social science critique presented alongside this dataset in the UN report.
What's the critique?
We were forced to look at the 13th best country in the world for human development, realize it is actively breaking the planetary boundaries to maintain that status, and ask a terrifying question.
Is our fundamental definition of development fatally flawed? Because if Singapore is the gold standard, if this is the model that every developing nation in the global south is currently striving to replicate, we have a fatal math problem.
You have an existential crisis. The Singapore model is brilliant in a vacuum. It proves unequivocally that extreme economic efficiency and fair wealth distribution can be achieved through state-led capitalism.
It solves the 20th century equation.
Yes, but it simultaneously exposes a massive catastrophic blind spot regarding environmental justice.
Let's play out the logic. Let's imagine we succeed in our global mission. We pull all 8 billion people on Earth up to Singapore's exact standard of living.
Okay, let's imagine that.
Everyone on the planet gets access to world-class healthcare, lives to be 84 years old, gets 12 years of high-level education, and lives in a household making $111,000 a year.
Sounds incredible.
But to sustain that, all 8 billion of us adopt their 53-ton material footprint and 8-ton carbon emission rate. What
Yeah,
happens?
The planetary boundaries instantly collapse.
Instant.
Yes. The Earth cannot physically support a global population living the Singapore model. It is mathematically, thermodynamically impossible.
Wow.
The physical raw materials simply do not exist in the Earth's crust to sustain that level of extraction across 8 billion people, and the atmosphere would violently overheat trying to absorb that volume of carbon.
It creates this deeply uncomfortable imagery of an unbalanced scale.
How so?
On one side of the scale, you have this magnificent heavy weight of human triumph. Economic prosperity, decades of extra life, highly educated minds, and minimized inequality.
Right.
But it is so heavy that it completely unmoors the ecological balance on the other side.
Yeah.
High income and long life do not equal a high-quality human future if that future takes place on an ecologically bankrupt, uninhabitable planet.
That realization is the philosophical crisis tearing through modern economics right now.
Yeah.
For an entire century, the industrialized North told the developing South, here's the blueprint. Industrialize, urbanize, extract resources, consume aggressively, grow your GDP at all costs, and you will eventually achieve human development.
But now, with the introduction of the PHDI, we essentially have to look at developing nations and say, actually, you cannot develop the way we did. The blueprint is a suicide pact. You cannot use it.
Which feels incredibly hypocritical, right?
It absolutely does.
You can't look at a developing nation that is just trying to get its citizens access to antibiotics, basic electricity, and concrete housing and tell them to halt their progress for the sake of the environment.
No, you can't.
But at the exact same time, humanity cannot survive if they develop using our current high-extraction, high-emission model. So what is the off-ramp? How do we fix the mirrors so the reflections match?
This is the shared global mission for the next 50 years, and ironically, it is Singapore's ultimate defining test.
What's the goal?
The objective is no longer simply to push the traditional HDI score up. The goal is to maintain that beautiful 0.946 HDI while aggressively, systematically shrinking the 34% planetary penalty.
So the objective is to engineer a society where the PHDI curve rises up to seamlessly meet the HDI curve. Exactly. It's about closing the gap, eliminating the friction between prosperity and extraction.
Right.
Future global competitiveness will no longer be determined by who has the highest GDP or the most billionaires. The new paradigm of success is low-carbon human development, and it relies entirely on a concept known as decoupled growth.
Decoupled growth. Historically, human progress has been tightly coupled to extraction.
Like chained together.
Exactly. If your economy grew by 10%, your resource consumption and your carbon emissions grew by 10%. If you wanted to generate $1 million of new wealth, you had to physically rip $1 million worth of coal, timber, or iron out of the ground.
That was the reality of the industrial age. Decoupling means finding a way to sever that chain.
Sever it completely.
Yes. It means growing the intangible value of your economy, expanding human well-being, technological innovation, artificial intelligence, and high-level services, while simultaneously flatlining or even shrinking the sheer physical mass of material you extract from the Earth.
And if we are being honest, if there's any country on the planet that possesses the concentrated capital, the hyper-educated workforce, and the agile, highly efficient state infrastructure to figure out how to decouple growth from physical extraction, it is probably Singapore.
I would bet on them.
They already solved the impossible puzzle of 20th century equitable capitalism. Now they have to solve the 21st century survival puzzle.
The new macroeconomic motto is no longer simply to develop, it is to survive sustainably.
As you listen to this and you reflect on your own daily life, whether you are making decisions about your corporate supply chain, voting on local zoning and infrastructure, or just evaluating your personal consumption habits, the goalpost for what constitutes a successful life has fundamentally moved.
It really has.
The goal is no longer just unchecked accumulation. The goal is growing your value, your intellect, and your well-being without indiscriminately expanding your footprint.
It demands a complete rewiring of how we interact with the material world.
It truly does. Let's take a moment to recap the incredible, contradictory journey we have taken through the UN data today.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We started by tracking the genuine triumph of global health and wealth over the last 30 years, moving beyond the blunt instrument of GDP to a nuanced, three-dimensional understanding of human development.
And then we confronted the structural friction of inequality.
Right, breaking down exactly how and why 22% of global progress just vanishes into the gap between the rich and the poor.
We examine Singapore as the ultimate case study of success, marveling at their rise to number 13 in the world, and analyzing how their state-led housing and healthcare apparatus proved that a society can generate hyperwealth while distributing it fairly.
But then we faced the brutal reality check of the Planetary Pressures Index. We uncovered the math behind the 53-ton material footprint.
30 sedans stacked on top of each other.
Yep. We saw how our most highly developed societies are currently functioning as our most ecologically destructive ones, sending a utopia plummeting 90 places down the global rankings when the bill for extraction finally comes due.
It is the defining paradox of our time.
And as we close out this deep dive into the true mechanics and costs of global prosperity, we want to leave you with a final, lingering concept to explore on your own.
For the last century, humanity has measured its progress entirely by its capacity to conquer nature, by our ability to extract from the earth and rapidly convert raw matter into wealth, comfort, and longevity.
We built our entire definition of success around what we could take.
But as you consider the gaping chasm between those two mirrors, between traditional economic development and the physical limits of our planet, consider this. What if, in the 21st century, the ultimate measure of a highly advanced, truly developed society is no longer defined by what it is powerful enough to extract,
But by what it is disciplined enough to leave untouched? A completely new reflection to strive for. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.